Greetings, everybody. It gives me immense joy to welcome each one of you to today's event, which is hosted by INHAF and partnered with Arc Design, IUDI, Karnataka Chapter, and Urban Frame Private Limited. This is quite an association today because we are connecting across the globe, and a wonderful forum to actually open out this discussion regarding this major cusp of change and claims to be are being positioned today. The rhetoric on our city, your city, my city is becoming louder and more amplified. Today's webinar on rethinking cities, cities as a place, city as people, and recapturing the place for the people becomes very interesting and very relevant as a point of discussion. Dear viewers, I wish to draw your focus to the chat box. There is a write-up around today's theme, a brief note on the speakers, the host and partners too. Please note, if you have any questions, use the Q&A box and not the chat box, because that's the one which will be kind of sifted out as the conversations go forward. Here, I would like to call upon Kirti Shah. Fondly, we call him Kirti Bhai, to make an initial address around this initiative. Kirti Bhai, all yours. Meanwhile, as Kirti Bhai joins us, there's very interesting sets of questions which are being posed. Who's the city for? How different are the stakeholders reacting to it? Is the state involved? Are societies involved? Who lays claims for these public areas? What makes a great public space? Are these urban spaces becoming homogeneous? Are there contestations between the spectacle of this urban space to actual using of the public space? So these are all components which are kind of getting weaved into one another. And I think it's an apt moment today with all what we're seeing around us to see who the city actually belongs to and how we relook at reimagining our own cities. So with this, Kirti Bhai, if you can take over. So what we can do is, I'm sure he's struggling with his connectivity. We will continue to roll on from where we.
He seems muted.
So what we can effectively do is to look at a quick round of introduction from our speakers. And you know what? Honestly, there's an august set of outstanding minds today who are amongst us as speakers. Professor K.T. Ravindran, my guru, based out of Delhi, founder, president of IUDI, you can name it. I'm saying architect, urban designer, educationist, advisor. I'm saying it's one complete package rolled into one. Ashwin Mahesh from Bangalore, social technologist, urbanist himself, dabbles with politics, as a scientist with NASA, an outstanding mind. Thank you, Ashwin, for being here. Gita, from all the way from Cape Town, amazing body of work, focuses on regenerative systems and how to use regenerative as an idea in settlements. Thanks, Gita, for being here with us. Prasoon, another outstanding mind, architect, urban designer, technologist, and completely focused on what he can do for communities. And he carries an outstanding aspect of work around him. Thank each one of you for being around here. And I'm sure that we have lots to offer as the discussion goes forward. Katie, sir, this is, the floor is open. I think you should start rolling on.
All right. Thank you, Anup. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, you're audible, sir.
Yep. Yep. So basically, I am not going to show any slides. I'll just try and introduce some of the issues which I think are of central concern as far as our understanding of what is public space and how do people interface with it, and B, about what are the issues that we are likely to confront in the near future vis-a-vis design of public spaces. Now, first of all, I'd like to state that the idea of the public itself is an idea of the collective. It's not about the individual private world, it's about a collective world. I wouldn't say it's like open to all kind of collective world, but it's perhaps it is culturally defined. That's different cultures have a different way of looking at or defining what is public for themselves and what is their sense of privacy. So the private world and the public world are kind of they're mutually generative. That is, one gives rise to the other, and the other in turn affects what is private. And from that perspective, it's the experience of the collective is what is played out in what we call public spaces. Now, public spaces, as we understand today, uh, is not just a mechanical product, but it's a cultural product, which in fact its design, its structure, its relationships with people, and the way people relate in those spaces, they are all culturally defined. So therefore, when you say that you are designing for a collective experience, you are in fact designing for a collective cultural experience. You know? And in fact, this is precisely what urban design does. Urban design, in fact, tries to design that experience by using and by deploying different instruments of physical instruments of design. So I don't think I should elaborate on it right now. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to elaborate on it. The second issue that I'd like to flag is that uh, our current image of uh, what is the Indian city and how do public spaces form in that, etc., conditioned by historic factors also. If you look at the standard Indian city, whether it's a metropolis or a small town or even a small rural type of settlement, it always has a dichotomous positioning of what is the old city and what's the new city. That is, except perhaps for Chandigarh and Dadinagar, all other Indian cities have this dichotomous positioning vis-a-vis the old city and the new city. And all the investment, all the capital, as we know now, actually flows into the new city, and all the so-called contemporary concepts of urban design are applied to the new city. And the old city simply remains, kind of something which people negotiate themselves. Now, in the old city, the configuration of public spaces are quite different from that of the new part, because our concept of the new part is impacted by the way post-Renaissance democratic spaces in the West has evolved. In fact, they say that a space which is accessible to all people in a democratic network is a public space. But this all is defined by what is called community, and community has a totally different connotation in the Indian scenario. In fact, when we say community, we are not talking about, in India, we are not talking about a homogenized mass with very similar demands. We are looking at a completely varied kind of very pluralistic kind of population base, which does not amount to one community with one perception and one set of demands on the public space. We see the community as something sometimes of opposing interests. because our old cities are, or even large parts of our new cities are also full of very heavy mixed use, and mixed use has got a number of different type of functions, all of them making demands, different kind of demands on the public space. So when you say it is based on community perception and community access of space, it means a differentiated access. This is the point which we can come to later for more discussion. But the point here to make is that we are progressively moving towards the perception of the public space as defined in the post-Renaissance democratic Western concepts of space. That is, a space which is accessible to all, uniformly accessed, and is maintained by the public and so on. Whereas the bazaar in India is, in the traditional cities, is a very important and perhaps culturally, commercially, and historically very important public space. Whereas in the West, it would be totally a different type of place. And these bazaars are also differentiated into specializations depending on their linkages with the rest of the city and so on. It's a far more complex issue of the morphology of the whole city. We will not labor into that part more. But the in India also suffer from another kind of schizoid condition. That is, when I say schizoid condition, I mean it's pulled from two sides, perhaps generating a kind of creative tension which allows the city to renegotiate itself and move and not stay static. This happens because there is the huge surge of capital coming into our cities through privatized developments and so on, and they are staking claim to the spaces in the city and the better and best spaces in the city, whether it's an open space or it's a swampy area, or it's a culturally significant space, or it's an environmentally significant space. The capital is trying to flow into those spaces and take them over and turn them into limited access spaces, which are not really public spaces, but access only for commercial transactions. Now, this is happening on one side in every big city, and that's where we see the invasion of the, simplistically, the invasion of the glass box into the core of our cities, invasion of flyovers and huge parking lots, etc., into our cities, which progressively are pushing the people out of the street. Now, this is a process which has been unleashed for quite a long time, and this literal invasion by capital into the core of our cities is now being resisted by a new wave of resistance from the ground. There is a ground swell, which is kind of almost equivalent to the Arab Spring, where people are now standing up and asking for their space back. And as the subject of discipline of urban design and other disciplines in social sciences and planning, etc., have also grown progressively, there are more and more professionals who are also operating like activists who are claiming the city back for the people from these forces. So there is this simultaneous dichotomous positioning of the capital and the people on two sides, claiming the same space in the city. So the contestation for the city and contestation for the open spaces in the city has now heightened. And this is an issue that we will have to face. And the resolution of this issue will actually give us direction towards new growth of the growth of the newer dimensions of the city. Now, all this pedestrianization movement, the movement for increasing cycle ridership, etc., that we see today are actually the results of this groundswell. These are not just results, these are manifestations of that groundswell. And it is this through this groundswell that we can reclaim the city back to the people. In this, this is happily growing, and what we have now come into understand vis-a-vis our cities post-pandemic is also a very significant renegotiation of these costs. We know now that the huge capital which flew in and took over the city and created so many hundreds of jobs, gave us the idea that they are bringing prosperity and growth into the cities, have actually been left standing while we had this huge padayatra of workers back into their villages. So the post-pandemic condition, which has brought into focus a dichotomous condition that exists between the urban poor and the capital in the city, has now become very stark. And it is very clear now that we cannot negotiate the cities going forward anymore using the same old game. We'll have to revisit our cities to see how we need to accommodate this 40–50% of the people of the city who have been living in conditions of utter deprivation, whether it is in places of living or public spaces. Where all these migrants that we see, all the children we see carrying on their shoulders or dragging along on the road, where were these kids playing? Where were the public spaces for all those old people they're carrying on their shoulders? Where were the places where these people could relax? What did the city provide for them? These are questions that we have never asked. And as an extension of that working group, which is now involved in the Padayatra, we can also see now that as an extension of this, the idea also goes into looking at other deprived communities like people, slum dwellers, and even artisans who service our construction industry. Where are these people living? How are they living? What is their share of access to public spaces? What is the provision and structure of those spaces? What are we planned for? Even if you look at the hawkers in the city, even though there is a hawkers law that exists in the country since almost 15 years, even in spite of that, we still have not made any proper provision for hawkers to be able to survive in the city. It's not only that it provides all the entrepreneurial group among the working class with great access to the public space as a place of transaction, it also has been the place from where they could make available very cheap products for the poor, for the urban poor. And what is the provision that we are going to make for these people when they're back into the city, if at all they come back into the city? These are questions that are looming large, which need to be answered. And Anup, do I have more time, or should I now stop and go on to the issues later?
So we can reloop on
Anup, can you
the
hear me?
issues post Ashwin, and yeah, you can
Anup,
we can reloop on the issues.
All right. So I'll then stop here, and thank you.
Yeah, and we can take the next set forward, and we can regroup a question.
Sure. I have 5 more questions which I will raise. 5 questions. More questions. Emanating audience. I'll raise that later. Thank you.
Ashwin, you can get started.
Thanks, Anup. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. So, I was listening to Katie sir, and he obviously has a vocabulary of talking about the problems around public space, our understanding and acceptance of it, which is not part of my professional training. I'm not an architect, I'm not a planner and all of that. And so perhaps what I'll first try to do is to essentially ask some questions simply as they occur to somebody who's coming from a different vantage point and coming from a different starting point. So I'll start with this. Most public problems, I think of them as having to do with challenges in three spheres. I believe that development works well if the state, market, and society are in some kind of balance. I don't mean that if state, market, and society are in balance, development outcomes will follow. That's not what I mean. I mean that the balance between state, market, and society itself is development. That anytime we walk away from that balance, we're actually going to create a lot of public problems. And it is only by searching for that balance again and again that we can come to some understanding of the problems. In the matter of public spaces, let's take the state first. And I'll begin by asking, what is not a public space? You know, often people sort of have a lot to say about what is a public space, but what is not a public space? And you know, one sort of trivial answer to that could be that whatever is private is not public, or whatever is not public is private. We tend to see private, public as a kind of a dichotomy, as it were, that they are opposites of each other. So then let's move on to talking about private spaces for a minute and ask an interesting question. What is a private space? If you ask people, name a private space, tell me one private space that you can think of. What is the most common answer that people will give? The most common answer they will give is that their home is a private space. That is the space that is most private, that they know with the greatest familiarity. A home is a private space. But then immediately, if you go from that, you come to the question that dominates a lot of these kinds of conversations. What about people who don't have homes? What is their imagination of a private space? We come to public space. The problem we see immediately is not that people don't have public space. The first problem is that people don't have private space. If you don't solve the problem of providing adequacy in private space, you can never get to the problem of adequacy in public space. Think of all the people that you know who have adequate access to public space. I'm willing to bet that all of them have adequate access to private space as well. And that's one way of thinking about it, that there is a problem with the way we think about it. We have to start with the adequacy question. Even private spaces are often inadequate, right? I mean, people live 6 to a room and 8 to a house and 15 to a shelter in India. So it's not just having a physical space in some way that makes something adequate or inadequate. It's being private is not sufficiently adequate. As a result, we have done something which is deeply harmful to our imagination of the city. Almost everything that is social is operating as though it is commercial now. Every single thing that is social. You want a park, you pay for a house that comes with a park, and you pay often, in fact, you pay a premium not to build on a property. Which is kind of bizarre that you normally pay people for doing things. We have reached a situation in our management of land where we pay people a premium for not doing anything to the land. So if a community has some additional space, we actually pay more for that rather than less for it, right? Or just the same price. And I'm not saying that these are bad choices for people to make, but these have consequences, and we have to accept the totality of what we are getting into. Rental housing, I mean, while rental housing, it could be very easy to say that 30% of the building plan approvals in Bangalore or in any other city should be given for rental housing only. We don't even have a strategy on rental housing. We don't even have a plan. The assumption is that landowners will go to the development authority and submit building plans for approval, and some subset of those landowners will let their houses on rent. This is the government's approach to renting. Even though every architect and urban planner in the world will say that the fastest way to make higher quality housing accessible to more people is to improve the supply of rental housing. But if you improve the supply of rental housing, the cost of private housing will drop. Because people can access at rental costs the things that others are now accessing only by buying spaces. So what the state has done, the state has turned the upper class and the upper middle class into willing participants in exclusion. You have money, you can therefore buy access to public spaces by buying access to private spaces. And as long as you don't question this arrangement, you will have the public space that you need. But if you question this arrangement, keep in mind that your property will lose value and you'll have to accept that as well. So essentially we've become caught in the very thing that we say we want to overcome. And we have to think about that. Next, I want to come to the question of society. We talked about things that the state has done. I want to talk about society. Is the road in front of your house Sorry, did I just get disconnected?
We just lost you for a fraction.
Yeah. Okay, I'm back now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Is the road in front of your house a public space? I mean, this seems like a simple question, right? But actually the answer is, it depends on the road. If that road is inside a community, and if that community has a gate, it's not really a public space. Correct? But if your house is truly street facing, like in the old layouts that we have in Bangalore or in any other house in most parts of the country, then it's sort of the road in front of your house is a public space. So we have a situation in which increasingly things are not even defined by their form. Things are defined by the transactions that happen around those forms. It's like you have paid for this road, and you have paid for this road to be more or less your road. And by your taxes, you are deemed to have paid for other people's roads also. So this is kind of a bizarre thing, and it plays out in a very, very terrible, I'm going to say, social way. I want to tell you a small story about a friend of mine. He went to see his mother one day, several years ago. And when he went to see his mother, she lives on a house which is sort of on a street side house, in the sense that you open a gate and you walk into the house. There's nothing more to it. He went to see his mother. And when he went to see his mother, she was joyous and she welcomed him with the greatest happiness. Like, oh, my son, really, right? I'm so glad to see you. And then some days later, she came to see him. And she was confronted by a very different experience. She was confronted by a person who effectively challenged her right to be in her son's home and asked her to prove that she had some right to go to her son's home. He said, they even called up the son and says, koi lady aaya hai. Now you ask yourself, just as a human being, if your mother comes to visit you, do you want her to be challenged at the gate or do you want to welcome her? You have to ask this question because increasingly, without thinking about what we are doing, we are building a society in which if your mother comes to the gate, the assumption is that she could rob one of your neighbors. And therefore, she has to be verified to be permitted into your house. And this is what we have begun calling a community. And within this sense of community, we define public spaces and our spaces and things like that. It's ridiculous. We make no distinction between a community and a campus. Peter Block wrote a fantastic book called Community. But he says a community is one that enables the capacities of its people and the gifts of its people. A campus operates on trust, distrust, and fear. Should I be afraid that the people visiting my neighbors could be thieves and muggers? Is that what we call a community? I think these are important questions because we sort of blindly go into situations without asking why we do the things that we do. And it's important to think through that. We also believe that a lot of these things cannot be changed. And this is another kind of schizophrenia. Katie sir talked about one kind of schizophrenia. There's another kind of schizophrenia. You go to people who are very successful in corporate careers, and they're always happy to tell you about how well they're doing in corporate life. They're doing well, they have a house, they bought a car, they're sort of doing well, and I'm happy for them. And then when you ask them, why don't you do a few things to improve your neighborhood by working with your local city councillor or with just local officials, they often say, no, I can't do that. And this can't is an interesting word. And you know, people like you, Kirtibai, will like this word because they don't say, I won't do that. They say, I can't do that. And there's a big difference between the can't and won't. Won't is a word that many professional people have banished from the vocabulary of their personal success. Yet, when confronted with a public problem, the first word they can think of is can't. There's a massive schizophrenia between how they see themselves to be successful and capable and sort of enterprising in private life and completely powerless and inept in public issues. It's unnecessary, but it's almost embraced only like an excuse to get away from public problems. So we have to look at this too. The society has its biases and its anxieties. These biases and anxieties are becoming obstacles to public purpose itself. If we do not embrace a public purpose, we cannot get public spaces. The spaces reflect the purpose for which we choose to live together. If that doesn't have a public sentiment, the space can never have and exhibit that public sentiment. Then I'll come to market, finally. And there's not a whole lot I want to say about this because I haven't thought about this very much, but I have one example which was intriguing. One could ask, is there a market for public spaces? Can we just sort of create a market that would enable public spaces and maybe on that basis drive down the price so that more and more people can access the market? And it's a reasonable question to ask, and some people have even tried it. My friend Naresh Narsiman built, he was the architect for a big mall here in the city. And one of the things that he built in that facility, or got built in that facility, was a really large public space. It was actually an artificial lake with all sorts of things around it. And in one of his presentations, I heard him say, this is probably the largest privately built public space in the city. It's a privately built space. It's built as a commercial space even. It's got lots of shops around and all of that. But you can actually go and loiter in that space. You can just walk through the gate and you can hang around in this place. You're not required to buy anything. It is a commercial space in some sense, but it is also created by a market. And one could argue that some of our malls are like that. These are not true public spaces in the way we imagine public spaces, but it explains a lot why people go there. There is a space in which people feel they're allowed to loiter. People feel that there is an acceptance of their presence without being challenged on the basis of being able to conduct a transaction. And that's important. Design and adequacy have a role to play. That if you actually figure out how to design things in the marketplace so that they are constantly focused on the adequacy of public spaces, then I think it is possible, even in the private sector, to become promoters of public spaces. And one last thing I will say is that today we are increasingly seeing a shared economy. The shared economy takes excess capacity and makes it available to more and more people. That's the very essence of the shared economy. Excess capacity exposed through platforms. But we don't apply that to physical space itself. Physical spaces that could potentially be used by lots of people when others are not using it are still considered private to exclude anyone else from using it, even when they're not used by their so-called owners. So there is another schizophrenia that is emerging. On the one hand, we're all becoming consumers in the shared economy. On the other hand, the way we live is constantly teaching us how not to share. And that schizophrenia as well is building up. What I've tried to do in the last 10 or 12 minutes is simply say the way we have organized state, market, and society are inherently working against a public purpose driven way of imagining public space. And we have to pause and correct that behavior. And because that behavior also includes society, it is actually about correcting personal behavior too. You can't change any of the market or the state if society is unwilling to change. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ashwin. I think that's a wonderful dialogue of how we can look at market, society, and state, and how we look at the differentiated aspects which come through. Kirtibai is with us. Kirtibai, can you go ahead and share your views before we get in Gita and Prasoon?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, I think, and I'm sorry that I'm slightly out of tune because I was supposed to be first. But and I'm not necessarily, I think, talking about the subject. I'm talking about the entire design of this program and why we are doing it. As an organizer, we are constantly asked questions, and I'm trying to answer them, and in the context also tell people how we look upon cities and what they're supposed to do. There are 4 questions which are asked constantly. The first question is, why are we doing not 1 or 2, but as many as 30 webinars? Especially when I think the webinars are raining day and night. Why are we doing this? What is the purpose? What is the objective? What is sought to be achieved? This is the first question that is asked to us time and again. Second question, which essentially comes from the title of this meetings, is why, what do you mean by rethinking cities? Question is, what is there to be rethink about cities? We can talk about making cities, building cities, planning cities, living in cities, but why thinking cities? Why rethinking cities? This is the second question that comes up time and again. The third question, which not many people ask, but the people who really study what we're doing, ask, what is the city URI? The citizen for urban initiative, in which these 30 webinars are supposed to kind of fill in. And the fourth question that is asked is, why are we doing it now at the webinar, at the pandemic time? I'll try and answer this question in the context of what we're trying to do. Let me take last question the first. And this is, as a matter of fact, the best time to ask question about cities. The reason is, COVID is predominantly a urban disease. We know very well now that 50% of the cases that we have in India, of about over 3 lakhs, are essentially from 5 cities. And if you look at globally, if you look at USA, look at Russia, UK, Italy, and these are essentially urban places, and therefore COVID is essentially an urban disease. And therefore we got to kind of think about cities in the context of this pandemic. Second thing, COVID is now. Other important kind of crisis and disaster which is awaiting us is the climate change, is the global warming. We must know that COVID may or may not have touched us, but there is no way that climate change will spare us, because it will bring in more earthquakes, cyclones, floods, famines. So the first part is looking at this cities in the context of this disasters, this big calamities, which, and the reason you've got to look upon cities in the context is this: the cities, as we know very well, are very highly carbon producing. They have very high carbon footprints. And you can't really go deeper into that. It's very important to say that there is a big relationship between carbon footprints and the cities that we have. Second thing that we need to kind of talk about is this, that cities are essentially very complex. On the one hand, cities are engines of economic growth. As we know, in India, 32% of the people produce 68% of GDP, and this GDP will increase to 75% in about 10 years' time. This is one part of the story where cities are economic growth centers. But the other part of the story is this: the cities, world city occupy just 2% of the space land. They produce 75, they consume 75% of the resources, and they throw 75% of the waste in the environment. And therefore, you cannot talk about overall sustainability without talking about urban sustainability. And therefore, when we talk about cities, we've got to be talking about cities, this production system, their consumption system, their construction system, their movement system will need to change if we really want sustainable world and sustainable cities. Third thing, very quickly, that I want to mention is this, and this is where I want to kind of bring in 4 dimensions of why we need to think about cities and why we need to think about cities very deeply. First is the look at the whole issue of population, and I don't know how many know about this, but we were something like 372 million people in 2011. We are expected to be 520 million people in 2030, and will be somewhere like 840 million people by 2050. We're talking about becoming double the size of urban population just in 30 years' time. And that's a question to ask is, are we equipped to handle this growth? Are we ready to kind of take this large number of people? And this large number of people will not go anywhere. They will probably go to places which are dense. They will also probably go to places like slums where they're already dense. So the first question to ask is, are we ready to deal with population explosion which is taking place? The second thing that we have to look into is the whole aspect of resources. Now, there are several estimates saying that if we really want to kind of build infrastructure for our cities, you require something of the order of $640 billion in the next 20 years. That's the kind of money we require if you want water, if you want electricity, and if you want roads done. $640 billion. Now, this figure you will be able to compare only when you know that we had a program called JNNURM. Under that program, over a period of 10 years, we spent $14 billion, and that to huffing and puffing, which really meant we neither had the resources nor we were prepared capacity-wise to spend this money. So second issue that requires us to think about cities is the resources. Where are they going to come from? How are we going to use them? The third very important issue is the demographic issues. I don't know whether we know this, but India has something like 800 million people below the age of 35. These are the people who are entering job markets. This country needs 1 million jobs a month, and we probably produce 1/10 of them because ours is a what you call jobless growth. So the question to ask is, where are these jobs going to be created? If the cities don't create this job, who will create them? And as it appears from now that if you want to create jobs, cities as they are will require to be rethought. As you know, 90% of employment in this country is in the informal sector, and that is not highly healthy, nor it is sustainable. And the fourth part that you're going to need to think about when you think about cities are relationship with the villages. We're talking about developing 7,940 cities. We are forgetting that we have 6,38,000 villages. Can we talk about developing cities without thinking about developing villages? And this pandemic, I think, showed us that if you don't develop villages simultaneously with cities, you would have a huge problem of migration. You would have skewed development. And therefore, what one is talking about is this, that if we want cities to be developed, we have to rethink about them. And this rethinking cannot be done by Sarkar alone. We have got to rethink with society. We've got to bring in professionals. We've got to think in business, industries, academic, civil society, NGOs. So this effort we are putting in the context of organizing this webinars, essentially is the effort in that direction. We're trying to take these issues to communities, to society, to people, saying that time has come for us to think about this. Time has come to see that we do not get bowled over by the events, but we are prepared for it.
Thank you, Kirti.
Just 1 minute.
Yeah.
The reason we are talking about 30 webinars is this, that urbanization is a very complex thing. You've got to talk about population, resources, governance, water, all that. And therefore, we thought if we have a large number of webinars, we'll be able to kind of do justice to this. And the last point is this, that all this would happen in partnership. Partnership with government, partnership with civil society, partnership with professionals. So this entire effort is to create platform where people could come together, where people could share, and people could contribute to the process of defining problems and finding solutions. That is what we're trying to do. And therefore, your presence, your participation is very, very valuable. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirti. Thank you so much for putting a perspective to this. Gita, I'm sure there's sizable the other part of the world where we see different associations, and you come from a point of looking at a lot of regenerative urbanism. So it's yours. Take over, please. You're on a mute, Gita, if you can unmute yourself. Yeah, Gita, you can go ahead, Gita. You are on mute. You can go ahead.
Okay, and full screen share. Okay, Kirti, thank you very much. I think as cities of the Global South, we very much come from a two-city syndrome, where there are cities for the rich and cities for the poor, or places for the rich and places for the poor. In the South African context, it's much more polarized because we are essentially a spatial apartheid city. And for the last 40 years, since we met Kirti in the early 80s, it's been a preoccupation of mine to think about how low-income communities can begin to find their own resources to improve their opportunities for both income, but also for accommodation. So what I'm going to be focusing on is how we rethink urban resources that inherently belong to the poor already, and look at it from the lens of regenerative systems design. My sense is that probably the state is spending as much money in reactive rehabilitation and responses to the health and climate and other issues anyway. And yet we have to find a way of interrupting that mechanism so that we begin to do what we know is right. So today I'm just going to share some of my favorite ideas and concepts, and then just share with you one or two contexts and scales so that we can have a thought around those. Now, In thinking about public places and spaces, it occurs to me that for the poor particularly, the places and spaces revert very much to the very basics of what is required. So, you know, the question of the core things like markets or places for worship or gathering in terms of meetings and things that communities do, recreational areas, and the everyday needs. How do we deal with those? And how do we deal with those in a context where there's just not even enough space for the shacks that need to be there? Having said that, I think that the climate change and water issues hit the poorest the worst. So I don't think we can think about public places and space making without thinking of the global and the broader imperatives. So managing the watershed is one of them for me. It was interesting for me when I met the chief planner of Berlin that they're beginning to uncover their river system within the entire city and reconnect it. And that is beginning to redefine the property values. Now that's all well and good, but it doesn't help the poor. However, and I will share just an example of how we rethink the watershed system and rediscover it in our city contexts. Generally, our urban mobility has run roughshod over the way in which watersheds should work. The other thing I want to note is that in the African context, what we've identified is that if we think about the problem creatively, we would require 800 cities of 1 million people each, distributed in and around all of the major countries, in order to deal with the rapid urbanization problem that we are still to face in the African context. I think one might think about this differently in the Indian context, but at the same time, I would ask a question as to whether new city pieces or city extensions could use this idea of rethinking the watershed differently from rethinking the watershed in existing urban areas. The second imperative is actually to think about the water steps. And they're really to think about the water balance in terms of particular boundaries. And I would use watershed boundaries to think about those. And then inside of that, understand the fit for purpose use of water so that the apportionment in terms of potable, non-potable, irrigation, etc., is all understood. And in Australia, in the Australian cities, they've done quite good work around this to begin to understand exactly what the water balance could be and how we rethink the fit for purpose use of water. The third aspect is climate change. And again, the poorest are going to be the worst affected in terms of climate change. And I think critical to that is the management of the watersheds, to build the water soil compartments, to address waste, fauna, flora in an integrated way, so that biodiversity, natural materials regeneration, etc., is improved, and that we slow the urban water and we increase the recharge. Now, all of that can begin to look very different. I mean, I'm aware from my time when I worked in India in the 1980s, and Kirtibai has said this, is that the water table in most cities has dropped phenomenally because of the amount of water that's abstracted. The fourth concept or imperative that I'm going to share is the notion of thrivability. And I think this is going to begin to affect all of us because the quality and the quantity of food and the nutritional level of the food that we receive these days is not adequate. So local food, the recovery and the use of urban water and organic waste to improve the nutrition and the mental health and urban comfort. I'm going to skip through a little bit faster now because I won't have enough time for everything. And then the last one particularly is air quality. Whichever way we cut it and dice it, the air quality in our cities is not going to improve unless we seriously consider how that works. So the notion of urban greenways, of trees, public transport, bikeways, walkability, breathability, the opportunity for people to be outside and in the green is a phenomenal urban health issue that needs to be addressed. There are 5 concepts I'm going to share with you that deal with these. The slides speak for themselves, so I'm not going to talk about those. You can read them later. Westcape is an extension to the city of Cape Town. The city of Cape Town, where I live, has 4 million households. About a quarter of those are poorly housed. And for the last 20 or 30 years, we've been grappling with how to address the problems of the squatter settlements. And we just can't get anywhere. So about 10 years ago, we became involved in the notion of creating an extension to the city of Cape Town in one of its natural extension corridors. And that's where we explored the notion of designing from the watershed. And I have a diagram where I'll share with you some of the thoughts there. What's interesting about thinking about the extension of the city is that the problem of urbanization is not only the problem of the urbanization of the poor. We find that younger folk today in our country, the average age of first-time home ownership, even for people who can afford it, is 37.5 years. Until then, most of them will probably rent, or many of them are reverting back to staying with their families. So if we think about making the new city, we need to think about how we can maybe begin to create it in a way that integrates, if there are 4 or 5 levels of housing, that it integrates as many of those in a spectrum. And if we do it in that way, that becomes an economic generator as a city investment opportunity. The second concept that I want to just have us think about is the green city of the South Bogota in Colombia, where Mayor Penaloza did a lot of greening and urban parks, has improved its air quality, affordable, safe access and mobility for people in urban forestry, together with the BRT and integrated transport system. Now, what's interesting for me is when I go to a place like Nairobi or even in Nigeria, we don't have it as much here because we're very well regulated state and we don't allow informal activity anywhere. But in Nairobi particularly, what's interesting is the high level of informal activity producing formal goods. So things like urban nurseries, furniture production, et cetera, et cetera. So this question of public space as street or street as public space or semi-private space is very interesting for me. And then Havana is a third concept where in the 70s, within 3 years, Havana became 80% self-sufficient in its vegetable needs by recapturing all of its organic waste. And it, at one foul swoop, dealt with the waste problem, but converted it into food. And I think there's a lot we can learn from there. And essentially, there were 3 categories of sites that they created that could become accessible to people in different ways to produce food. Now, I think that's a critical aspect because if we look at the food miles, in our country, certainly the food miles travel long distances for the food to actually come to your plate. And if we can become cities that produce and feed itself at as localized a space as possible, then I think we'll be doing well. And then I'm going to briefly share a small informal settlement project where we work with the idea of creating urban productive villages. And there, what I grappled with was this idea of internalizing the resources that people use, famous Gandhian concept of inward economy. And I said, what if people could own their own energy and their own energy business, their food business, as well as their water business, and actually look after their needs and ensure that their localized spend goes into their communities. I'll just very briefly share some eye candy around that. And then the idea of continuous productive urban landscape systems. We have tremendous corridors all over the city, which is wasted land. Electricity servitudes, railway corridors, margins around roadways, et cetera, et cetera. What if we put those to use and created jobs and created productive landscape systems? That would begin to restore some of the urban corridors and begin to create a level of workability, engagement, as well as some social spaces that could be really amazing. It's interesting for me, if you read the air quality reports of London after they planted their trees in the early 80s, what a big difference that has made, as well as the creature corridors that have been created. Johannesburg, for example, is a very arid city, but it shows up as a subtropical area on satellite imagery because they have used water in a particular way. So those are the kind of contexts and scales that I'm going to be sharing. And this is just eye candy that shows with Bogota. I think also with our poorer communities, even if the buildings are very simple boxes with windows, and we are going to have to go up, if we rethink the streets and the pauses that you can begin to see in a picture like this, but also how we actually see, how we view this fabric. In this instance, they created a macro mural in Bogota, and it begins to really show the city up in a very different way. And here's just a view of one of the streets, which is clearly very much supporting the vehicular movement, but on the fringes you can see where it also supports the pedestrian movements. So this hierarchy of mobility, which typically we just think of in terms of vehicles, need to be rethought so that our children can actually play in the streets again. This is now the land area of the West Cape project that I had mentioned. And here what we did was that this entire area is essentially one watershed. And so what we did was we mapped all the greenways and corridors. This is an electricity servitude. These are part of the biodiversity network, which we have to retain. And we recognize that there's a very gentle undulation of the site that would allow us to begin to take blue-green corridors through the entire settlement so that it arrived in the middle. And the middle then becomes essentially a water machine where both clean water but also processed water begins to enter into this water system, which ultimately goes to the sea. But we would then catch it and recycle it back to feed from the top of the watershed into this system. So the idea of green and blue systems as being the foundation to actually thinking of all of the movement systems is a concept that we've carried through in this design. And inside of that, then we defined a hierarchy of public spaces. We said from the city park, where you have the blue and green corridors running, through to different scales of spaces and what they do. And particularly how they primarily focus on facilitating people and then cars is something that we begin to take forward. And at a diagrammatic level, we then begin to indicate how notions of walkability are built in. Again, as we build our future cities, there's going to be less and less revenue for really just making those gorgeous urban parks, etc., which we would all like to have in our cities. But if we cluster all of our civic facilities like our schools and health education functions around public spaces, we have a better chance of being able to maintain them and manage them, because the cost of managing them becomes very, very high. And to the bottom over here is a normative diagram that we created, which begins to look at a couple of things. In this instance, this particular settlement is in the excavation area, sorry, not excavation area, it's in the area, the exclusion area outside of the nuclear facility. So it would need to be able to allow for rapid removal of people in the case of emergencies. In any case, our approach to design is to structure it around a scale of public spaces that begins to allow different things to happen, from green systems to worship, to bazaars, to parking, to formal and informal trading. This is an image of Havana, where you see what they call organoponicos, which is organic hydroponics. And you can see the medium density settlement, and then the spaces in between allow the breathability. But what they did was they took every single space in the city and they initiated a state-initiated productive system where there were 3 scales of public land parcel, 3 types of leases, 3 target productive groups that they targeted. And a lot of people got a lot of employment and they were able to generate their food. Within 3 years, they were 80% self-sufficient. They diverted the organic waste, etc. Now, it's interesting, Kirtibai, that you were talking about setting up the research centers and the support centers. I believe that India might have that infrastructure. I have very fond memories of the kind of research institutions and the kind of support that they were able to provide. This is an image of the outlet that then sells the vegetables directly into its communities. This last project is a project where in the city of Cape Town, that's the wider footprint of the metropolitan area. The pink area is where the people of who are not white have traditionally lived, and they are the poorer suburbs. In the middle of our city, that's the ocean on this side, that's the mountain range, and our agricultural areas to the north. And we are a peninsula, so it's a very difficult terrain to inhabit. Our poorest suburbs, where the majority of the people live, has in the depth of it a horticultural area, and this whole area in the middle actually sits above a perched aquifer. And at the moment, 60% of our vegetables are produced here, travel 11 kilometers north and 11 kilometers back, by which stage most of it is actually spoilt. So we were given a project to work with the provincial government where this edge of the Philippi horticultural area is being reconsidered for urban development. And we're working on one little project where we've developed an urban development framework. This is not a design, it's a calculator, it's a design calculator, where we brought in all the urban design parameters that you would normally take into a normal city making situation. So this is a real location of informal settlements in the surrounding area, where it begins the rollover process of rehabilitating the existing informal settlement. So this is a greenfields development. And all these space-making elements of circulation, gateways, entries, different uses, etc., is addressed in the first slide to the left. In the second slide, you see the schools being at the center of that. And then you see little urban village precincts that are created, which basically facilitate the way in which 500 households at a time can orientate around a central space, which creates both the gathering space as well as the formal and informal markets. To the left here are old existing sheds, which would be linked back to the urban agriculture production area. And this would then process the substandard food into accessible food that is fed into the school nutrition programs, which is a government project, and it would create a whole bunch of jobs and opportunities. So there's 9 or 10 precincts here, and then we are required to recreate the urban recharge pre-development, after the development, and instead of creating detention ponds, which become basically really horrible places for dumping and bad things to happen, we've distributed the recharge into the tree system of double avenues and the courtyards, etc. And when it's very rainy, we have extreme rainfall in the winter, then some of these would become mini detention ponds, which would very rapidly drain away. We then took the budget that the government gave us and we said, what if we, instead of putting the houses in a row, we stack them up 4 or 5 at a time, then what you would spend for a 40 square meter house would actually create a surplus amount that would allow you to then be able to fill that in with non-flammable materials quite rapidly. So the owner of that subsidized house can then become a mini landlord. And on the roofs of all of these apartments, please note that these are not designs, these are schematics for calculators. You could then generate food using organic hydroponic systems or hydroponic systems, and the roofs would become solar generators. Now, this is a 19-hectare site that has about 5 or 6 categories of public spaces. It has a 5-hectare rooftop farm, which will generate a surplus of 1,130 Rand per household per month. It's very close to the airport. We elected to actually model the food production on an export market and also exporting to inside the city to the higher end of microgreens, etc. And the food from the horticultural area will feed the community at a local level. So it's a business model. The solar PV and the energy is a business, and the water harvesting, this work was being developed as we were heading for day 0, and our city had indicated that we would all have to live in 50 liters per day. And we said that if we rethought that differently, we could potentially live on 30 liters from the grid. The remainder could be drawn from the aquifer. We would then cleanse and recycle the water and utilize it for flush and communal laundries. And that way we would only put back 10 liters into the sewer. This study has not been confirmed yet. I had to raise separate funding to do the water and energy studies, but I've done that. And then these are the governance precincts that are defined in this settlement. And each governance precinct then would have the rules and regulations that could be worked, including safety and security, inside each of these areas. These precincts are designed in terms of both identity and definition, but also to have open spaces on the corners so that one works with natural surveillance, but there's a degree of recognition that people begin to have with each other. And then just as a visual impression of a continuous productive urban landscape system, if we begin to connect these, but we also connect those, the red rectangles in this instance, this is a British example, are actually food production in containers, because they too are looking at how you reduce the miles between where food is produced and where it's consumed. I believe that if we utilized every rooftop and every space in our urban areas to produce food, we could do a lot in order to make a difference. In this instance, what's very interesting is that all the local schools, hospitals, parks, NGOs, etc., have partnered to do this project, and they're utilizing all the open spaces. And what's fantastic about it is the difference it makes in the level of community connectivity, the nutrition profile of people, and you can do nutritional targeting, and also how it makes a difference in the mental health, particularly of people. So I'm going to pause there. Those are my details. I'm happy to be in touch with anyone who would like to find out some more. And thank you very much for this opportunity to share. I'll stop screen share now.
Thank you, Gita. I think it was quite a connect of how we're looking at the 5 imperatives and how it leads into the zero food mile system. We have Prasoon, who's now on.
I'm trying to get out of screen share.
Yep. Prasoon, you can get rolling. And Prasoon comes from an amazing background of actually working from the bottom up, working with a lot of the needy. So Prasoon, here we go.
Sorry. Okay.
So Prasoon, we can get started. I think you need to unmute yourself, Prasoon.
Okay, thank you for having me here. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I think some of the previous speakers, what they spoke about has really caught my attention, especially Ashwin, who ended by saying that we have to pause and correct ourselves. And I really think about this oftentimes because I'm now 42 years old. And I see that I've heard this thing about pausing and correcting ourselves for at least since the time I started going to school, but I haven't seen the correction happening. We do take pauses, we do seminars like this, we talk about it, we write, we read in the newspaper. But if we look back at our cities, is there a single city in India that we can today say is better off today than it was 40 years ago in terms of poverty, in terms of life, quality of life, health issues, safety issues, women issues, water, sustainability, environment, you name it. And I doubt if there's a single city that we can name which was better off when we were growing as kids to what it is today. And this is a question that bogged me, that we keep having these conversations, but what we don't know is how to action these conversations and what and when will this change will come. In fact, the question that's being put forward today is quite pertinent about who does the public space belong to. So this is a picture from Chandni Chowk in New Delhi, where I grew up as a kid. And if you look at this picture, which a lot of people would call chaos, so who does the space really belong to? Is it the car? Is it the private car? Is it the public transportation? Is it the rickshaws? Is it the pedestrians? Is it the government? Is it the private space? Is it the temple? Is it the masjid? Who does it belong to? And do we really need to work on the systems like Mr. Katie mentioned about the fact that bringing in Western ideas of what urban design is to our cities? So the question really becomes that in India, I think in most and in a lot of other countries as well, the city really belongs to who's the fittest and who can fight for their rights in the city. And it hasn't grown to be a very public entity in nature. It could belong to the politicians when they want the city to be cordoned off for themselves or not cordoned off as well. It could belong to the police, depending on how they want to do it. It could belong to us when we can go and put gates on public streets and make them private. And we can start calling those enclaves, which are supposed to be for everyone, which only belong to us. Or we can go start from scratch and build condominiums, which are private or public or semi-public or semi-private. Do we really know what is the definition? And a lot of these things are happening because of the failure on the public side, where we are taking into account the idea of creating our own private public spaces, because that's the only place where we can sustain. Or when we create bridges and flyovers without having cognizance of what kind of traffic there is in our cities, then the powerful bulls can still ensure that they encroach and they come onto parts of public spaces where we actually don't want them to come. Or when the entire country goes into a lockdown, then we even take over the highways and they become our pedestrian paths because we've never cared for a lot of pedestrians. So it really it depends on what is the state we are in and who has the capacity at a certain point in time to come over and take the world. The same goes on with vacant lands, where you can encroach for housing, for schools, and then people are left with no choice as to do what to do with the land. Or even pathways, where if you have no home, and we talked about the size of the home, I think even comes secondary to the fact whether you have access to a home or not. And the street becomes a home, and that becomes because this person can encroach and can actually occupy this public street. It becomes a small little private space in this public domain. But at the same time, all the images that you saw were of cars or people, but even trees and nature has the capacity to encroach if we allow it to become and flourish like this. This picture is from Lutyens, Delhi. But more often, when you look at new cities now or new roadways we build, we don't let the nature flourish to the extent where it can really occupy and sustain itself for decades and decades to come. The question really becomes for a lot of architects and urban designers and planners who are part of this audience as to what makes a great public space. And this is something that we study in school, we study when we open magazines, when we go and talk to people. And most often, the examples we see are from cities which are very different and alien to us. And we try and reference these all the times when we make presentations to governments, to our clients, when we want to study and when we want to propose ideas. But what we often don't realize is why does a space like this work in a city like New York, but can probably not be executed in a place like Mumbai? Or this is in Germany. Why does it flourish as a public space without any boundary walls, but why it cannot flourish here? Or from my city in Singapore, where in the heart of downtown, even in 21st century, the city is coming in and building a large park, which in other space cities, it's just not possible or not being done. Even Mr. Mahesh talked about the fact of paying money for parks and for open spaces, but can we really pay so much money for a large open space? We are today even building buildings in our rivers and in our spaces which are left over. And we keep hearing of the fact that, these images are good, what you're talking about is good, but change is coming and it's going to come soon. And change takes time, but the change often is so slow that we study about change in our studios in architecture education. We go to conferences and this is my picture on the right side, you can see how excited I am. This was in 2009, that the change is coming. But for millions and millions of people, the change never comes. We fantasize, we romanticize slums. This is a picture from Dharavi, which all of us love for its vibrancy, for its public nature, the idea of public and private, and how the different uses and people's lifestyle mixes. You can see the vibrancy, the 24-hour beauty of this. But would any of us want to move and live there? There's such a distinction today between what we want ourselves and what we want for others. And the change for many of these people never ever comes. How many of the slum dwellers we know have actually moved out to reasonable housing and they're flourishing just like how we are in this day and age? In fact, this is so fashionable to work on projects of Dharavi that I also worked there as a student, I worked as a professional, and even if you go to schools today, you find a lot of thesis and architecture projects happening on slum redevelopment work. And talking about the public and private domain and what is their responsibility in the cities. But what we don't know is that none of these plans often get applied, or if they get applied, they're always just little pilot projects which never flourish. Because the question that we don't ask ourselves is what is the reason why public spaces don't flourish, why we haven't built a reasonable public space in all these decades since India became independent, and why we are still dependent on public spaces which were probably built when we were not an independent country. And that's a question that we have to ask ourselves, that are we as designers and architects really solving the right problem in the public domain? Or are we really solving the wrong problem? And I have worked on many projects. This is one of my work, which actually I worked with Anup on a 600-meter tall tower in Kuala Lumpur with a lot of public spaces. This is a project in Mumbai, a high-rise tower. Mumbai Airport project was one of the projects that I worked on, but these are all privately done projects. Museum projects. This is project in Ahmedabad. And all these projects have not been built or have been built, but they have not created what we talk about the equality in the cities of this merging of the public and private and really taking over the public space. The more and more spaces are becoming private and we are confusing ourselves between what is public and what is private. And migration is happening. People are moving. We see more people on the streets encroaching, work happening which is of such poor quality that we don't want it to happen. But we are unwilling to ask the question that do we know the answer? If I was to ask this audience, do we know the answer of how can we claim the public space? Most people would give an answer and not say that we don't know. And this question, to accept that we don't know the answer because we have failed to build a city which is worth living in India today, is a question that prompted me to start Billion Bricks many, many years ago. But only focusing on the idea of housing, which I was not thinking would be touched upon, but Mr. Mahesh again touched upon that idea of housing and the inadequacy of it, of how that leads to the public space becoming more secondary. We work on many different ideas, but the idea really for us to question everything that we think is the right way to do. If public participation is something we talk about, is to claim public space, is that the right approach? Has it worked for us? When we see the shopping malls and all the success of spaces that we see in our cities today, do they work with the principles of public participation, with community construction, community development, with alternative materials, or with sustainability? Or are these aspects which we just see in little pockets of success stories, but are not at mass scale? We question every aspect of what we've learned, and then we go down and ensure that we work on a bottom-up approach to make sure that the change comes for at least the people that we are talking about. The project that I just showed you is a housing project that we did in Cambodia. Here we did a school where the boundary between what is the school building and the outside is completely merged. The classroom becomes a dance theater and the outside becomes a classroom as well. And then we designed these shelters for people on the streets to just make sure that they don't die in extreme weather conditions. Cities like Delhi lose about 3,000 to 4,000 people every year, and this has been consistent statistics for 40 years, and no one has come up with a solution. And when I came up my tents and I took them to the city of Delhi, the Delhi government told me, Prasoon, these are so good looking. Why would you provide them to people on the streets? So we have this idea that when it comes to people on the streets and we have to look for solutions, or when we have to look for public domain, we have to look for solutions which are probably not high quality. And you can see these solutions work across the world, but if we change our approach, where it's not about the principles of what does it or how do we do it, but really about the user and who uses it. And now we are bringing this new concept of from a housing perspective to really say that can we open up the housing market to people who can't own a home by providing an alternative way for them to pay the mortgages. This is a house concept that we built in outside of Aurangabad, where the energy is sold to pay the mortgage on behalf of the homeowner. So the problem we are not solving is of the housing, but the problem of financing. So the question really becomes that what we have to ask ourselves is when we ask questions like, are we losing the spaces in our cities? That are we really looking for the right solution and are we asking the right problem? And are we trying to solve it the right way as well? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prasoon. I think that was quite engaging. I think you raised a very pertinent question of to even asking ourselves whether we don't know. And I think sometimes accepting that itself throws many answers out. In the meanwhile, what's happened is I've had some very interesting questions passed by. I will roll them into one and allow this entire panel to take a go at that. There was Nagesh Aras who asked for, can commons that are encroached be gifted away free cost on ownership basis? There was a very interesting question added to that is, can you actually sanitize spaces? I think he comes from a point when you design these enclaves where the hawkers, beggars are all excluded from that process. There was Jaya Anjaria who asked, I think this question is pertinent to Bhuj, where she asked that malls or the mall culture is eroding the public space. And this goes back to what Ashwin was asking earlier, whether there can be this the idea of the state market and society collaborating at some point. Shraddha Dasgupta raises a very interesting question, I thought, and comes from more a recommendation oblique question. She asked that can technology lead to decentralization, whether it will actually reduce migration at some point. I thought that was quite interesting. Then we have Mansi Balbhargava, who I think was a pertinent question back to Gita, asking whether 5 imperatives and the 5 concepts, are these indicators for de-developing cities? Might be, as an entire panel, we can take that. There was Urmila Pawar who did ask a very interesting question of when you actually look at urban farming and land value, can that actually be synchronized, or and land value, I'm assuming, when it becomes more expensive, can you actually bridge the gap between what you're spending for and what you're getting out of it? So in a nutshell, as these questions are rolling, these are some of the questions which we can take a go at. So this is open to all. So let me start with Katie. So would you want to take a view on this? So you're on mute, sir.
When you say a view on this, I have noted down 4 distinctly different questions.
Yeah, it was.
Can I just pick the question on which I would like to answer?
Yes, sir, sure, you can do that.
Because it is also one of the 5 issues that are written down.
That's right, yeah.
Is the issue of decentralization. Yes. And what would decentralization do to the social fabric? Yeah. Standard method that we use for decentralization is to provide growth nodes and link them with mass transportation. And this mass transportation business is that we need to move, as opposed to the private car, we need to move to public transport networks. Now, most of these public transport networks, particularly when it comes to the metro and so on, are based on highly mechanized, artificial intelligence driven, very high capital intensive systems. Yeah? And Bombay, if you take traditionally how Bombay is grown into, how the public transport is a train network system, and everyone's life being organized by the trains they take. Yeah? So there is a whole kind of transformation of the social fabric, which actually takes place when you introduce a highly mechanized, capital intensive, efficient system of movement, which actually is the core of any decentralization plan. So there is a big dilemma here. I don't claim to have an answer for it, but there is a big dilemma. What does these highly mechanized, electronically controlled, fast moving, high capital intensive entities do to people's minds and their lives? It's a question that we have not answered. It's a question that was raised by, in the 1960s, raised by Herbert Marcuse when he wrote about the one-dimensional city, one-dimensional man, who actually is simply geared to leave his suburban home to go to work and come back home. And the whole family has a division of the male going to work and the female staying on, and the schools being nearby, and the whole model of neighborhood developed around it. So it has a transformative quality, the way we move. And I would, this is an interesting question because it raises even more questions in my head about mass transportation and decentralization. Should I go into Anup?
Yeah, I'll just lead this. There's a leading question to Ashwin on this. I think it comes from a point that when you link the state, market, and society. Is there a possibility of an equilibrium in this? Because most often you would find that when growth happens, one of them takes over and becomes a bigger spike, and then the other gets left over. In fact, it comes from how the planning mechanism works, how neighborhoods works. Yeah, and then you have different agencies kind of playing different roles. So there's always a split between the way these are run, and only once it's probably synchronized, they work well. What's your take on this, Ashwin?
You have to sort of see this through the lens of society first. And I'll ask you a simple question. Is the person who lives next door to you a member of your community? I mean, this seems like a very ridiculous question to ask, right? It's like, what kind of question is it to ask if your next door neighbor is a member of your community? But I'm willing to guarantee that there are lots and lots and lots of people for whom their next door neighbor is not a member of their community, because the community is designed in such a way that it has boundaries. And if you live at the edge of that community, your next door neighbor to one side is actually not a member of your community. Right? I'm just giving you a simple example. Sometimes you might not like your next door neighbor even within your community. That's a different problem. I don't want to get into that. But I'm saying, if from a purely physical sense, in all communities that we call communities today have gates and boundaries and all of that. And what that means is that very, very many people look across their boundary wall at somebody and see that person as not a member of their community. You can't build public purpose from this starting point. You have to sort of first acknowledge that there is something bizarre about this kind of arrangement itself. The society can discipline the market and the state, but it has to start by saying, this isn't really what I want either the market or the state to be. The state is a political animal. It responds to what people say they want. But when people say they want things that are like this, the state will respond to that. The market responds to your wallet. And if you vote with your wallet, people are going to say the market is going to be built for that wallet. But I think there is an element in between. If I come to you and ask you, Anup, would you ever do something because it is the right thing to do, even if it costs you some money? I'm sure you would say yes. We haven't built a market for that.
That's right.
Right? There are lots and lots of people who would do the right thing, even if it costs them some money. Whereas this whole rational economics theory tells you again and again that nobody would do the right thing if it costs them money. Right? You have to get away from this thing. I feel it's possible to build deliberate public intent into market products because those who are marketing those products want to. And it's up to that group of people to work together to make the footprint that says, because we did it in this way, we are successful. And I look at some of the stuff that we did with lithium as part of this stuff. Right? Everybody talks about sustainability. We never talk about sustainability. We're just running electric cars. And that's enough to be able to say that this is happening. That I think it's possible to find analogous examples in housing. You know, the gesture project that we've been talking about over here. If you can actually build large-scale rental housing, you would have a working example. You don't really need to go and argue for it in front of the state. You can simply go to that and say, what you failed to do as the state, we did as the market. And I think that's the key part, that there are people out there who, by their collaboration with each other, can create the outcomes that the market is not creating. And we have to develop that market.
And this leads me on to, as an extended question to Gita, since you come from work experience in South Africa, do you think a synchronization of the state, market, and society would happen? Because it comes from a point that there was an interesting parameter which you spoke about of how we're looking at this idea of a regenerative city, green city, city feeding people. Then you spoke about urban productive villages, then urban green corridors, then leading back into urban farming. Because in this process, you actually need a very strong state to agree to this process. You need a market force because that is something which is going into the market, and a society wanting to buy this first principle. So do you see this working, or is there a different kind of push and pull happening around?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't think they're easy answers. I think that I'm talking from the South African examples and the African examples, our state systems are so stratified and they are so prescribed in terms of what different departments and different institutions need to do. So for example, in our context, our housing department is tasked with producing smarty blocks. Some are pink, some are white, some are green. And that's all they can do. So their ability to actually do something that's outside of their mandate just doesn't exist. So what we've been doing through my company is to play a awareness building and advocacy role. And in doing that, what we do is we connect up wherever we can, all the way up to the Premier's office or even to the National Treasury, to try and show by these examples. And that's why I referred to the examples that I was showing not as designs, but as calculators, because we take the real parameters of what they're working with. And what I did was, this is a real project which we are going to implement, but I asked permission from my client to show them how they could spend their money differently. And then I went and raised funding externally to help me actually do those pre-feasibilities on the food and the energy and the water systems, and then took the results back to them. So we haven't won that battle yet. The question is, how are we going to achieve this? And so this question of who the agency is that drives any of what we're talking about, I think is a real problem. And that's where I think this INHAF initiative is actually quite valuable. That's one of the key questions we need to ask. Government is tasked with the government work that they do, and their briefs are very narrow. They don't have the flexibility that is needed. What's interesting for me in the Sao Paulo example is that the mayor, Jamie Lerner, actually, when he became the mayor, he was also a planner. He set up a special dedicated think tank that became his advisor of design and related specialists. And his strategies around the BRT, around the linking of the poor, because he couldn't change the spatial dimensions, he made accessibility a means by which to link poorer people to the access to public spaces and the goods and rights of the city. And they also stepped the tariffs for the rides on the bus rapid transport system in order to allow that access. So the thought that occurred to me in preparation for this was that, do we need to find a way of creating that opportunity to create small but sharp advisory units that can assist mayors or decision makers in key government positions to begin to address some of these strategies? Because if we leave business to function as business as normal, we're not going to get any different to what we've got now. And that's one of the issues that we're grappling with at the moment. So we are now beginning to engage with the unions. So I've got a separate company that I also work with, which is made up of people from other disciplines. And then we also have clubbed up with people from other disciplines to say, okay, how do we begin to act as a professional advocacy and lobby group, but with practical projects? So they're in a project by project basis. We're not talking theory. We're saying, this is what you can do, this is how you can do. So the Westgate project, for example, is a private sector-led project, which is essentially doing all the work at the state. This is how you could actually address.
If I can interject there, actually leads on to what Prasoon was earlier speaking about. This, you spoke about encroachment in the sense of occupying a public domain, Prasoon. And most often that's the way our cities have claimed it, planned or unplanned, or if it's gated, sometimes you occupy edges, sometimes you force yourself. How is this parametric is going to get ironed out, or is this the mandate in which you'll start looking at the methods of reading a city? In fact, Katie spoke about something very interesting. He spoke about this groundswell. So I'm kind of linking this idea of groundswell in one way to this idea of encroachment. Would you want to throw some light on that? And post that, I'll ask Katie to take a shot at the groundswell story.
I think in today, the way the cities are structured and the way they are being run, and I think a lot of discussion is focused around the three pillars of the state, market, and society. The system is broken to the extent that there's no choice but to fight for each of the pillars for themselves and find whatever they can find. Right, and what we as human beings are good at doing is always to take the path of least resistance. So for a homeless person, the least resistant path is to just encroach and sleep on the street is the easiest thing for him or her to do, rather than maybe go to a state official and then say, demand for a housing, or go to a housing shelter and say, can I get an entry here? And then maybe he may not have the 5 rupees to go in, or 10 rupees, or it may be too dirty. He can't demand the quality. He can't go to a private developer because he will not be entertained. So the choice that people are making is what is easiest for them. While in a good scenario, the system would work in a way where all the three would come together for an efficient way to deliver the necessity public goods to every citizen.
Right.
And we have kind of, I think because of the failure of the state and the cohesiveness of the society, I think a lot of the things have been left to the market, not because market is right, but market is an easy and a fast way to show results.
That's right.
So the market's dominance is just to be able to showcase is something where people push a lot of things onto the market and say the market would actually drive it. And then we look at examples where the market-based economies have been successful without realizing the role that the society and the state played to ensure that the market would function in an efficient way and not in an inefficient way.
Yeah, that thanks, Prasoon. In fact, that leads us to this is to Katie. You spoke about the groundswell. I was trying to link the idea of the groundswell, and is this the idea of encroachment? And are they interconnected, or is this the new claim which will continue to happen in our cities?
They are intrinsically interconnected. They are not simply interconnected. Because what we call market and government is now the boundaries are blurred. We don't know who is the market and who is the government.
Right.
We don't know who is the custodian of the public space. Is the government the custodian? Is the police the custodian? Is the community the custodian? Is the local MLA the custodian? Who is the custodian of the public space? Who gives permissions for things to happen on the ground? Now, how are the collaborations between industry and government, or what we in classical terms call the private sector and the public sector, how these boundaries are completely blurred? We have a public-private sector, and we have a private-public sector.
That's right.
We are in a great dilemma in all this. And to a large extent, the way public spaces are being defined will also be determined by this collaborative role that the big capital and the government is doing, and unfortunately, not in the interest of people, but in the interest of larger GDP. Yeah? Right. GDP simply means more money. Okay? It's a classic question which came up in the pandemic, whether we should protect the economy or we should protect the people.
Yeah.
So India pretended to show that, when I say India, I include myself, we pretended to show that we want to save the people so that we have a shutdown. But what it actually done was that it kicked out 40 million people into a padayatra on the highways. It's very evident where the government is. At the same time, you have the announcements about how private companies are merging, how the Facebook is merging with one company and that company is advertising, and their slogan on the television screen is "the future is ours." It's obvious that the future is theirs,
Yeah,
because it's been bought over.
that's right.
So there is a small movement that is taking place on the ground in cities where people are now beginning to assert their rights over space, not over capital, not over power, not over collaborations, not one, any of those consequential things,
Right.
but on space. And that's where the role of us as professionals have been, where lots of associations and groups have been formed for cycling and walking, and there are new bylaws being brought out. Recently, just last week, there was a government order from the central government to all states saying that they should promote cycling and pedestrianization.
That's right.
Well, they themselves have done a big promotion of making 40 million people walk in the place of taking any kind of transport. So this is the kind of irony that we are living in, and these really show that the task I don't have answers. I'm raising all these questions because I have many more questions in my head than I have answers.
So, since we are running out of time, I thought I'll just summarize where we stand today as a series of takeaways. And there's a huge list of takeaways. If you'll give me permission, let me just read it out. One was equity as a basis of planning and urban design. I think that came out very pertinently. But there was also a very interesting aspect of the root values of continuity, connection, and openness as part of our design process in the urban side of things. Then I think there's a very interesting point of which was about reducing this tension between the public space and the spectacle. And most often the urban claim works around that. And a very interesting point which Ashwin raised was community should be built on trust. And most often the idea of community, what is this idea of edge in the community, or our neighbors inclusive in this process, is becoming far more evident in the conversation we've had. It also kind of throws back, if you may. So there are 7 points which I quickly made note on. Citywide strategy needs to focus on the form, function, and connectivity of the city as a whole. In fact, this was an extension of what Ashwin was speaking about. This goes back to the idea of local authorities. They should be able to design network for public space as part of their development plans. This is more or less what Gita was talking about, that how local authorities, government kind of becomes part of this process. Then it kind of leads to what Prasoon was talking about. And in fact, it's an extension of what both Gita and Prasoon spoke. It's at the neighborhood level, urban design should work which fosters social inclusion, gender equality, celebrate biodiversity, enable urban livelihoods. I think that's what was a whole take on this, that you will have now big movement happening back into the cities. I'm saying one movement was leaving the cities, but I'm sure that now people will move back. Then what are the inclusive processes which we can look at? And this leads to a very pertinent question which Prasoon spoke about. Will there be the next encroachment, or is it the right time to wake up and be far more accepting about this? Then it's coming from purely governance point of view. The side of regulations need to be reviewed to establish systems to create, revitalize, manage, and maintain public space. And that's a question which Katie also asked, that who manages them? Is there a mandate to this? Is it left up to government, or is it a public participative process? It goes back to what Gita kind of pitched in, and I rewrote it in my own little ways, that land value sharing and land readjustment tools could be used widely to capture private value, because that's what to a large extent even Ashwin was talking about, that when you have private value getting generated, can these be generated back as public space? So we have a very interesting point there. It leads to another very interesting point that investing in public space needs to be harnessed as a driver for economic and social development, gender equality, and strengthening the urban-rural linkages. Otherwise, that whole aspect is going to get lost in this part of top-down planning process, as we've seen. Then the instruments to enable the creation of public space from private-owned land are of critical importance, because if we don't deal with that, yeah, today we might say that is a CDP, or there might be a planning tool, or you might have local area plannings which would pop up very quickly. But if there needs to be a kind of a very interesting equilibrium between the way the state, the market, and society play a balanced role. This is for most of our viewers. All the questions which you've raised are going to be part of the INHAF website. You can go and visit that, and what answers we've got, we'll go back and restitch it into that. And since we're running out of time, we have just less than a couple of minutes. One guru mantra from each one of you on where do you think this idea of urban space and what we need to do, which we can take away. So we'll start with you, Katie.
Well, I'd like to, there were two issues which still remain unresolved in my mind, and I'd like to link what needs to be done to that. One thing is the introduction of technology, higher and higher technologies into all spheres of life. And it's not just an imminent issue, it's already here. Now, if you take the example of China, there's already the case of almost near total surveillance on every individual in public space. That surveillance is looming large in our cities. And one of the major fallout of that surveillance is what Mahesh had pointed out, trust, which is the foundation of any kind of active, healthy public space, public life. That trust is eroded. So this is an issue that we'll have to face when we embrace technology. We cannot discard technology, we need to embrace it. But when we embrace it, we need to worry also about the consequences. So given that scenario, I think the point that
So we're losing you.
About people coming back into the cities and looking for new jobs, negotiating life in the city, both in terms of work, living, as well as public open spaces. And of course, there are movements and so on. The biggest takeaways for me is from what Gita has brought out about the idea of reducing commuting by increasing dependencies on your immediate environs. So immediacy of dependencies on water, food, and movement is perhaps one direction in which we should be moving, because it will be one way, or it's be one way of creating a new groundwork, literally from people as well as from the actual earth. I think this is my takeaway. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ashwin, you would want to give it a shot? I think it looks like Ashwin has dropped out. Gita, would you want to, your little guru mantra for us?
I think if we don't start addressing things at a big picture level concurrently with practical steps, we're heading for big trouble. So we've got to lead with vision and imagination and act locally.
Thank you so much. Very well said. Prasoon, your last little guru mantra.
Yeah, I mean, there's hardly any guru mantra I can give, especially when the people like Professor Ravindran on this panel. That's why I only share my experiences. And I think the only thing I'll say is that I think is that really, I think the question really becomes on looking at cities and our ideas from an action perspective and from a sense of urgency, and really carefully see that oftentimes when we look at examples, are there learnings and replicability in them or not? Because more often when we look at examples that we look up to as our ideals and things to follow, the fact that they've not been repeated means that they probably work only in the circumstance that they exist and they're not replicable. And I think so we should be very careful with the learnings that we want to bring in with us, and are those learnings of value or not? So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think it's been a wonderful conversation. I think we've extended time, but nevertheless, you can't close this that way. Thank you. Thank each one of you for being part of this this panel discussion. And I'm sure we've enriched ourselves immensely. And thank you for being part of this. A little ending line: it's not enough to love a city. We must all also work to save it. Thank you so much, and hope you all have a wonderful day ahead, and good evening to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.